Hello, and welcome back to Scriptures Unlocked. In the previous presentation, we looked at God's covenant with Abram. In this presentation, I'll be focusing on Genesis chapter 16, which is entitled Abram and Hagar. And we'll read about a situation that Abram found himself in because of a plan that Sarah came up with in an attempt to help out God, so to speak. So this presentation is entitled Abram and Hagar. So Genesis 16 verse 1 starts by saying, Now Sarai, Abram's wife, bare him no children, and she had an handmaid, an Egyptian, whose name was Hagar, and that's the correct pronunciation. We are used to saying Hagar, but the correct pronunciation is Hagar. And Sarai said unto Abram, Behold now, Jehovah hath restrained me from bearing. I pray thee, go in unto my maid. It may be that I may obtain children by her, and that is very important. And Abram hearkened to the voice of Sarai. And this is where Abram went wrong. He should not have listened to his wife Sarai and follow this heathen practice that was common in Abram's time. So viewers, some months had now passed since God established his covenant with Abram in Genesis 15, because Abram was still 85 years old when the events of Genesis 16 transpired, where God had specifically told him that Eliezer would not be his heir, but that he would have a biological son that shall come forth out of his own bowels, and that's Genesis 15 verse 4. So with that promise in mind, Sarai decided to, quote unquote, help out God by approaching her husband with a possible solution, since she was now 75 years old and barren. Sarai's plan was to present her handmaiden Hagar to Abram to be a concubine in order to achieve her stated goal, which was to, and I quote, obtain children by her, end of quote. Viewers, Hagar was one of the Egyptian maidservants that Abram received when he told Pharaoh that Sarai was his sister. And this we read about in Genesis 12 verse 16. And he, Pharaoh, entreated Abram well for her sake, that's for Sarai's sake, because he had told Pharaoh that she was his sister, and Pharaoh had taken her into his house because he wanted her to be his wife. And as a result of that, Pharaoh gave Abram a lot of gifts. And notice some of the things that he got. He had sheep, oxen, he-asses, men servants, and notice maidservants. So Hagar was one of the maidservants that Abram received as a gift for Sarai. So viewers, in order for us to understand what was transpiring here, it is important for us to know the culture and the custom of the times in which Abram lived. And one of the customs that the heathen practiced was the custom of concubines. And I'll explain what this custom entailed. So Sarai's decision to use Hagar as a concubine was in keeping with the customs of the time, because in Old Testament times, men would acquire a concubine as a quote-unquote secondary wife for the primary purpose of producing a male heir and children in general if their wives were barren. This wasn't a practice that God condoned, because God's ideal was for one man and one woman. But because God endowed men, human beings, with free will, freedom of choice, men decided, because their wives were barren or had problems having children, they would take on a concubine for the purpose of producing children. And this is what Sarah was doing. So Genesis 16 is the first recorded instance of this happening in the scriptures. And we will see the very same thing again in Genesis 30, when both of Jacob's wives, Leah and Rachel, gave him their handmaidens, Zilpah and Bilhah, to be concubines. Notice what we are told in Genesis 30 verse 1 onwards. And when Rachel saw that she bare Jacob no children, because Rachel was barren, Rachel envied her sister and said unto Jacob, Give me children, or else I die. And Jacob's anger was kindled against Rachel, and he said, Am I in God's stead? what withheld from thee the fruit of the womb? And she said, behold, my maid, Bilhah, go in unto her. And this phrase again means to have sex. Go in is a euphemistic term. It's a Hebrew idiomatic expression, which means to have sexual intercourse. So Rachel was saying, go in unto my maid Bilhah, and she shall bear upon my knees, and notice other words, that I may also have children by her. The same thing that Sarah was planning to do. Use Hagar as a concubine to produce children for her. And what is important to note is that the child or children of the concubine was considered to be the wife's children. So even though the concubine gave birth to the child or children, the children were the wife's children. Notice Genesis 30 verse 4. And she, Rachel, gave him Bilhah, her handmaid, to wife. And this word wife here is the Hebrew word Isha, which I look at later. It simply means a woman, a female. It can either be a woman that is married or a woman that is unmarried. And here in this instance, Bilhah was being used as a concubine. She was not actually Jacob's wife, but it is used in this way to sound more palatable. And she gave him Bilhah, her handmaid, to wife. But we know that she's going to be used as a concubine because the context tells us this. And Jacob went in unto her, and that is the same euphemistic term again, which means to have sexual relations. And how we know? Verse 5 tells us, Jacob went in unto her, and Bilhah conceived. A woman can only conceive through the means of sexual intercourse. And Bilhah conceived and bare Jacob a son. And notice who named the child. And Rachel said, God hath judged me, and hath also heard my voice, and hath given me a son. Notice, Bilhah's child was considered by Rachel to be her son. Therefore, called she his name Dan. So notice, viewers, that Bilhah's son was considered by Rachel to be her son. And it was Rachel who actually gave the child the name Dan, which means judge. And Bilhah, Rachel's maid, notice the emphasis is being made very clear that Bilhah was Rachel's maid. And Bilhah, Rachel's maid, conceived again and bare Jacob a second son. And Rachel said, with great wrestlings have I wrestled with my sister, and I have prevailed. And she called his name Naphtali. So again, Rachel named the second child that Bilhah gave birth to. So Rachel was Jacob's favorite wife, but she was barren. And her sister Leah had already given Jacob 4 sons, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. So Rachel envied her and used her maid as a concubine to compete with Leah. So there was a big competition between both sisters. And you'll see why. Because in their culture, children were valuable. Children were seen as assets. It was a patriarchal society, and especially sons. So to produce sons for your husband was something that was greatly sought after. Notice Genesis 30 verse 9. When Leah saw that she had left bearing, meaning after giving birth to these 4 sons, she did not get pregnant for a long while. And when Leah saw that she had left bearing, she took Zilpah, her maid, and gave her Jacob to wife, to be used as a concubine as well. And Zilpah, Leah's maid, bare Jacob a son. And Leah said, a troop cometh, and she called his name Gad. And Zilpah, Leah's maid, bare Jacob a second son. And Leah said, happy am I, for the daughters will call me blessed. And she called his name Asher. Notice here, viewers, Leah having sons as being blessed. So viewers, Jacob fathered 12 sons with 4 women, from his 2 wives, Leah and Rachel, and from his 2 concubines, Bilhah and Zilpah. Here are the 12 tribes of Jacob. These are the sons of Jacob. Leah was Jacob's first wife. She was the elder sister of Rachel. Rachel was his second wife. And both of these wives of Jacob had maids. Rachel's maid was Bilhah, and Leah's maid was Zilpah. And from Zilpah, Jacob had two sons, Gad and Asher. From Rachel's maid, Bilhah, Jacob had two sons as well, Dan and Naphtali. And later, Rachel would have two sons of her own, Joseph and Benjamin. But notice as well, to make the point, that Zilpah and Bilhah were not Jacob's wives, but they were concubines. Notice what Genesis 35 verse 22 says. And it came to pass when Israel dwelt in that land, that is Jacob's name, that he would be given, that Reuben, Jacob's firstborn son, went and lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine. So here the scripture tells us that Bilhah was not Jacob's wife, but she was a concubine that was used by Rachel to produce children for her. And Israel heard of it, and now the sons of Jacob were 12. And we look at that word concubine a little later from now. So viewers, in the patriarchal culture of the ancient Near East, having many children with concubines was very common, because children, especially sons, were viewed as assets that created wealth for the family, and they also enhanced the family's workforce, since a man's sons often performed the role of a shepherd and tended to his livestock. So having many sons would mean you would need to go and get hired servants. Your sons could do the job of a shepherd and take care of your livestock. And in an agrarian society, they would take care of your crops as well, which was what generated wealth for the family. Viewers, what we also need to know about concubines is that concubines were granted certain rights and protections, but they were not equal in status or on the same level as a man's wife. Very important to note. However, a woman serving as a concubine was to be treated with respect and be seen as higher than a servant, but lower than a wife. She was also entitled to proper food and clothing. Even though God did not approve of the concubinage lifestyle, it was being practiced. So laws were later given to protect concubines from oppression. And we find these laws in Exodus 21, verse 7 onwards. Notice what God says. And if a man sell his daughter to be a maidservant, meaning she can serve as a concubine, she shall not go out as the men servants do. If she please not her master, who hath betrothed her to himself, then shall he let her be redeemed, meaning she could be sold. You would not sell a wife. You would divorce a wife, but concubines were not married. If she no longer found favor in her master's eyes, he could sell her. But notice what God says. To sell her unto a strange nation, he shall have no power, seeing he hath dealt deceitfully with her. He was to treat her with respect. Notice what God goes on to say. And if he had betrothed her unto his son, he shall deal with her after the manner of daughters. If he take him another wife, another woman, her food, her raiment, or her clothing, and their duty of marriage, meaning her conjugal rights, shall he not diminish. And if he do not these three unto her, then shall she go out free without money. He would have to release her. So if he took on another woman, whether she be another wife or another concubine, he had to ensure that her food, her clothing, and her conjugal rights were not infringed, were not diminished. And if he failed to do any of these three things, God says here that he should release her so that she could go out free without money. So he could not sell her. Viewers, another thing that we also need to know about concubines and their children is that children of concubines were legitimate children, but they were often seen and generally regarded as secondary to the children born to a wife, because concubines were not on the same status or on the same level as a man's wife. Notice what we are told here. But before that, it is also important to note that children of concubines were not given inheritance from their father. Even though they were seen as legitimate, generally they were not given inheritance, but they were treated well. Notice what happened with Abram. Genesis 25 verse 1 onwards tell us this. Then again, Abram took a wife, meaning another woman, and her name was Keturah. And as we will find out, Keturah was not Abram's wife. She was Abram's concubine after Sarai died. And notice what we are told. Genesis 25 verse 2. And Keturah, she bare him Zimran and Jokshan and Medan and Midian and Ishbak and Shua. And notice what we are told. And Abram gave all that he had unto Isaac. Isaac got all of Abram's inheritance, but unto the sons of the concubines. Notice here, the Bible is making a distinction here. The scripture is making a clear distinction between Sarah, who is the wife, who gave birth to Isaac, the promised seed, the promised child. He got all the inheritance. He got all that Abram had, all that Abram possessed. But notice verse 6. But unto the sons of the concubines, Abram had 2 concubines, Hagar, which we are reading about in Genesis 16, and he also had Keturah, which we are reading about here in Genesis 25. But unto the sons of the concubines, he had a son, his firstborn son Ishmael, which Hagar gave birth to, and he had 6 other sons with Keturah, who was his concubine. But unto the sons of the concubines, which Abram had, Abram gave gifts and sent them away from Isaac his son. So while Isaac inherited all of Abram's possessions, the sons of the concubines received gifts and they were sent away from Isaac because Isaac would inherit all that Abram had. Notice 1 Chronicles 1 verse 32 makes the very point that Keturah was not Abram's wife, but Abram's concubine. Now the sons of Keturah, Abram's concubine. So even though Genesis 25 verse 1 says that Abram took a wife, Genesis 25 verse 6 and 1 Chronicles 1 verse 32 makes it absolutely clear that Keturah was a concubine. Abraham had 8 sons, Ishmael with Hagar, Isaac with Sarah, and 6 children with Keturah. Notice the word that is translated as concubine. It is not even a Hebrew word, it's a heathen word that has been appropriated in Hebrew. The Hebrew word for concubine is pilegesh. It occurs 37 times in the Hebrew scriptures. It is translated as concubine 35 times, and it is Strong's H 6370. It simply means a concubine or a paramour. Notice that concubines were very common throughout the Old Testament period, and here are some of the kings who also had concubines. 2 Samuel 3 verse 7 says, and Saul had a concubine whose name was Rizpah. 2 Samuel 5 verse 13 says, and David took him more concubines and wives out of Jerusalem. And there were yet sons and daughters born to David. So David had many wives, but he also had concubines. Solomon had 700 wives, and he also had 300 concubines. So it was a well-known practice in the Old Testament time. It was a heathen practice, and Abram should not have listened to Sarah and gone down this route, because God had called him out of Ur of the Chaldees, away from Babylon, to establish him as a great man. But because of lack of faith, Abram acquiesced to Sarai's plan to sleep with Hagar, and as a result, it would pose problems in his family and cause problems for the world, which we are experiencing even today. So viewers, the digression about concubines was simply to prove that this custom was common in that day. So Sarai was tapping into the cultural norms of that time by allowing her servant Hagar to become a concubine. Notice what we are told in Genesis 16 verse 2 and 3. And Sarai said unto Abram, behold now, Jehovah hath restrained me from bearing. I pray thee, Go in unto my maid, have sexual relations with my maid. It may be that I may obtain children by her. And Abram hearkened to the voice of Sarai. And Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, her maid, the Egyptian, after Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan, and gave her to her husband Abram to be his wife, or in other words, his woman or his concubine. So viewers, the scripture informs us that this incident took place when Abram was 85 years old, and 10 years after he was called by God at the age of 75 years old. So 10 years have now passed. So Abram was now 85 years old when Sarai gave Hagar to be Abram's concubine. Scripture is absolutely clear on that point. However, the plan had unintended consequences because Hagar, Sarai's servant, started to act above her station in life and began to show contempt for Sarai when she became pregnant. Notice what we are told in Genesis 16, verse 4 and 5. And he, Abram, went in unto Hagar, and she conceived. And notice what happened as a result of her conceiving, her becoming pregnant. And when she, Hagar, saw that she had conceived, her mistress, who was Sarai, was despised in her eyes. And Sarai said unto Abram, my wrong be upon thee. I have given my maid into thy bosom. And when she saw that she had conceived, I was despised in her eyes. Jehovah, judge between me and thee. So viewers, Hagar's social standing did not change due to her pregnancy. She may have thought so, but she was still Sarai's servant who became a concubine. Hagar was not Abram's wife, and she was not on the same level as Sarai because it was Sarai who gave Hagar into Abram's bosom to perform the service of a concubine. Viewers, a woman is only considered to be a quote-unquote wife if a man takes her unto himself of his own volition. And this is made clear throughout the Old Testament. And it is the context that dictates if a woman is actually a wife in the truest sense, or if she's a mere concubine. But to make it more palatable, the translators use the word wife, but Hagar was not Abram's wife. She was Abram's concubine. And concubines were not on the same level or did not have equal status with a wife. Concubines often serve as maids to the wife. And that is why Hagar could be given by Sarai to Abram as a concubine. So viewers, those points must be made very clearly. So when Hagar got pregnant, she started to get uppity. She did not know her place and wanted to be elevated on equal status with Sarai because she was able to give Abram what Sarai could not. Sarai wanted to give her husband a child, but because she was barren, it was not possible. And she was now 75 years old because she was 10 years younger than Abram. So when Hagar got pregnant, she started to act above her station in life. Notice the Hebrew word translated as wife. It is the Hebrew word isha. It occurs 780 times in the Hebrew scriptures. It is Strong's H802. It has been translated as wife 425 times, woman 324 times. It is the generic term used for a woman or a female. And a woman or a female can either be a wife, meaning she's married to a man, or she can be unmarried. Sarai was the true wife of Abram. Hagar was a concubine. She was not married to Abraham. She was being used as a concubine or a surrogate to produce a child that would belong to Sarai. So viewers, even though it was Sarai's idea to give Hagar to Abram as a concubine, Sarai blamed Abram for Hagar showing her contempt. Sarai probably thought Abram was giving Hagar the wrong impression, that she was more than just a concubine, which resulted in Hagar thinking that she shared the same status with Sarai as a wife. But notice Abram's response when Sarai complained about Hagar's behavior after she became pregnant. But Abram said unto Sarai, behold, thy maid is in thy hand. And notice Abram made Sarai know that Hagar was your maid. Behold, thy maid is in thy hand. Do to her as it pleaseth thee. And when Sarai dealt hardly with her, she fled from her face. You can just imagine Sarai saying to Hagar, asking her to do something around the house. And she would show contempt for Sarai and come up with excuses as to why she could not do this because she was pregnant. So as a result of this, Sarai decided to teach Hagar a lesson in submission by treating her harshly, which again makes the point that she was a servant of Sarai and not on the same status as Sarai, because Sarai decided to teach her a lesson and she ran away. Genesis 16 verse 7 tells us, and the angel of Jehovah found her by a fountain of water in the wilderness, by the fountain in the way to Shur. Hagar ran away and was heading back to Egypt because that's where she came from. She was an Egyptian. Shur occurs only 6 times in the Hebrew scriptures. It is Strong's H 7793. It means wall. It is a place southwest of Palestine on the eastern border or within the border of Egypt. And this is where the Israelites would later pass through the wilderness of Shur after crossing the Red Sea. So Hagar was actually returning back to Egypt. Here is a map of Egypt and Israel. And here you can see the wilderness of Shur. Shur would later become the place that Ishmael, Hagar's son, would later settle. And you can see this in Genesis 25, verse 18. It says, Ishmael settled from Havilah to Shur, which is east of Egypt as one goes toward Assyria. It was located on the southwest of Palestine and on the eastern border of Egypt. Notice Genesis 16, verse 8. And the angel of Jehovah said unto Hagar, Sarai's maid, whence camest thou? And whither wilt thou go? And she said, I flee from the face of my mistress Sarai. So after Sarai began to treat her harshly, she now remembered her station in life. I flee from the face of my mistress Sarai. The Hebrew word translated as mistress is Gevereth. It is Strong's H 1404. It occurs 9 times in scripture. It is translated as mistress 7 times and lady twice. So Sarai was the mistress of the house. She was the lady of the house. She was Abram's queen. And mistress here simply means a woman who is in charge of servants. Sarai was the lady of the house, and Hagar was Sarai's servant, her maid. Notice verse 9 to 11. Notice what the angel of Jehovah said unto Sarai, which again proves that she was not on the same level as Sarai, who was Abram's wife. Return to thy mistress and submit thyself under her hands. I repeat, the angel told her, return to thy mistress and submit thyself under her hands. She was not on the same level as Sarai. And the angel of Jehovah said unto her, I will multiply thy seed exceedingly, that it shall not be numbered for multitude. And the angel of Jehovah said to Hagar, behold, thou art with child, and shall bear a son, and shall call his name Ishmael, because Jehovah hath heard thy affliction. Ishmael, the Hebrew word, is Ishmael. It comes from 2 Hebrew words, Shama, which means to hear or listen, and El, which means God. Ishmael is Strong's H 3458, and it occurs 48 times in the scriptures. Ishmael simply means God will hear or God will listen. He was the son of Abram and Sarai's handmaid Hagar and the progenitor of the Arabian people. So Ishmael would later become the father of the Arabic people. So Ishmael was the name of Abram's oldest son and the name of 5 other Israelites. And notice what the angel of Jehovah goes on to say to Hagar concerning this child that is in her womb. that will later be called Ishmael, and he will be a wild man. His hand will be against every man, and every man's hand against him, and he shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren. And she called in the name of Jehovah that spake unto her, Thou God seest me. For she said, Have I also here looked after him that seeth me? Wherefore the well was called Beher Lahai Roi. Behold, it is between Kadesh and Bered. Beher Lahai Roi occurs 3 times in scripture. It is Strong's H 883. Beher Lahai Roi means well of the living one seeing me. It is a well west of Kadesh, south of Israel. And the last 2 verses in the chapter tells us this. And Hagar bare Abram a son, and Abram called his son's name, which Hagar bare, Ishmael. And Abram was 86 years old, meaning he was 86 years old when Hagar bare Ishmael to Abraham. So viewers, there we have the completion of Genesis chapter 6. In this chapter, we looked at Sarah's plan to, quote unquote, help out God in producing a son that he had promised Abram. It was a bad plan, was fraught with many issues, as we found out. As soon as Hagar got pregnant, she started to act up. She wanted to be elevated on equal status with Sarai. She was a concubine. She was a maid to Sarai, who Sarai used as a concubine. And as a result of Abram listening to his wife, this caused serious problems in his family. And we know that Abram was a family man. And later, when Isaac was born and he was being weaned, Sarai, who would now be named Sarah at this time, would see Ishmael mocking Isaac. And she would say to Abram that he should cast out this bondwoman and her son, because Ishmael would not share in Isaac's inheritance. So Abram, by listening to his wife, set a dangerous precedence that his descendants would later follow by taking on concubines. And as a result of Abram sleeping with Hagar and producing Ishmael, who became the father of the Arabs, today we see the results of these 2 sons and their descendants fighting in the Middle East. You have the Palestinians, who are Arabs, descendants of Ishmael, and you have the Jews, who are descendants of Isaac, the Israelites. So today, the Arabic people considers the land of Israel, the land of Canaan, their rightful inheritance, because Ishmael was the firstborn son of Abram. And based on the law of the firstborn, Ishmael should have been given the inheritance. But as we studied in the previous presentation in Genesis 15, God made a covenant with Abram, and he established his covenant with Abram and Isaac, because Isaac was the promised seed that God was referring to, not Ishmael. So even though Ishmael was Abram's firstborn son, God superseded the right of the firstborn, and Isaac became the inheritor of all that Abram had, including the land of Israel, because God made a covenant with Abram by saying in clear and unequivocal terms that unto thee and thy seed, who is Isaac, have I given this land. So the war in the Middle East originated from this mistake that Abram made by sleeping with Hagar at the insistence of his wife Sarai. And this is what has caused the problems in the Middle East today. The war between the Arabs and the Jews is stemming from this mistake that Abram made in listening to Sarai, his wife, and sleeping with Hagar and producing Ishmael, who would later become the progenitor, the ancestor, the father of the Arabic people. So thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. And may God continue to bless us as we continue to study his words to prove all things. Have yourselves a great day.